Yaakov, the Torah tells us he lived 17 years in Egypt. And he passes away at the age of 147. And he summons his son Yosef. And he says to him, Al nosik b'rim Mitzrayim, I don't want to be buried in Egypt. And he asks him to take an oath. And Yosef takes the oath that he will not bury him there. He'll bury him in the Tomb of Machpelah, together with his forefathers. Avram's buried there, Yitzchak's buried there, the wives are buried there, and Leah, who's a matriarch, is buried there. Rachel was not buried. Rachel was not buried in the Moshe Machpelah, which we'll discuss. She was buried on the way to Hebron, Derech Beis Lechem. That's where she was buried. Now, why did Yaakov not want to be buried in Egypt? Firstly, he made Joseph take an oath. You know, taking an oath is something very serious. You only make a person take an oath that he should be committed, or more committed, because there's a concern he may not carry through. So by take the oath, that will guarantee he carries through. There's no question in Yaakov's mind that if Yosef gives his word, he's going to bury his father in Canaan, he's going to bury him in Canaan. So why did Yaakov insist that Yosef takes an oath and swears in the name of God that he's guaranteeing that he will bury him in the Moshe Machpelah? So the Midrash tells us that Yaakov was a very smart man. When Yosef initially was taken out of the dungeon to interpret the dreams of Pharaoh, he was elevated and promoted to be what? The viceroy of Egypt. There was nobody more powerful than Yosef in the world. He was the sustainer of all existence. That's who Yosef was. All the wealth of the world was gathered to Egypt. Now, the Talmud tells us the night before Yosef was released from prison, Gabriel the archangel was sent, and he taught him 70 languages. One night, 70 languages. And Yosef was fully proficient in 70 languages. Besides Hebrew, he spoke. Egyptian, probably he was in prison for 12 years. He picked up the language. But not as on a diplomatic level, not the classical Egyptian. Gabriel taught him every one of the languages on the classical level. Now, the question is, why? Why did he teach him 70 languages? And if he would have known 15 languages, language is only to be able to communicate. So how many languages does he need to communicate? What do you need 70 languages? But Gabriel taught him 70 languages. So ultimately, Yosef knew 71 languages. That's what he knew. Why was it important for him to know 71 languages? Now, when Pharaoh found out that Yosef knew 71 languages, he made him take an oath. He will never divulge that he knows 71 languages. Why? Because Paro spoke 70 languages. And if it would be known that Yosef speaks one language more than him, he would be dethroned. Because he speaks 71. So the obvious question is, does that really make a difference? You know, one language more, that's a basis for dethroning. That he should be removed from the throne, and Yosef would become the so-called the monarch. But he made him take an oath never to divulge that he knows 71. So we get into why. Hashem had sent Gabriel, the angel, to teach Yosef 70 languages. So Yosef should know one language more than Paro. But why was it so important for him to know one language more? And he made him take an oath, he will never divulge that. Because Yaakov made Joseph take an oath that he will bury him in Egypt, in Canaan. Why did he make him take the oath? Because if he wouldn't take the oath, and he goes to Paro after Yaakov passes away, he says, I'd like to bury my father in the tomb Machpelah in Canaan. He would say, nothing doing. I'm not allowing it. We want your father here. So Yosef's going to say to Paro, but I took an oath to my father that I'll carry through his wishes. So Pharaoh's going to say to Yosef, and if you violate the oath of your father, it's not the end of the world. So Yosef will say to Pharaoh, and if I break my oath to you, it will be the end of the world for you, because you're going to be dethroned. So Yaakov, knowing that this is what Yosef will have over him, and that will force him to release him, that's why he made him to take the oath. So it comes out very interesting. So why did Hashem send the archangel Gabriel to teach him 70 languages? To put Paro in this predicament that he must release Yaakov to be buried in Canaan, in the tomb of Machpelah. Okay? Now, what is so important no more than 70? 71, 70. Whoever heard of how many people know 70 languages? Talmud tells us to be a member of the Sanhedrin, you have to minimally understand 70 languages, besides speak it. Why? Because when the Sanhedrin, the High Court of Israel, receives testimony, they have to hear it directly from the witnesses. Otherwise, because it goes through an interpreter, through an intermediary, it's considered hearsay. You have to hear it directly from the witnesses. So if you don't understand the language, you don't hear it from the witnesses. Therefore, the judges who sit on the Sanhedrin, many of them have to be proficient in 70 languages for that reason. So 70 is a hefty number. 71 is beyond that. Why? So we explained in the past, what is the significance of numbers? What does the number 7 signify? The natural order. The world was created in 7 days. 7 is the natural order. 8 is the supernatural order. 8 supersedes, goes beyond the 7. 70 is multiples, 10 multiples of 7. So it's still, the profile is the physical profile, the material profile of existence. Rabbeinu Bachir points out, the monarch of Egypt, there was a title that every monarch carried. Pharaoh. Paro was the title of the monarch of Egypt. That was the office, Paro. Now, in the Paro, there are 3 Hebrew letters in that word. Aleph, Pei, Resh. Ophir. What does Ophir mean? Ophir means dust. Earthy, earth. That the foundation of the Egyptian civilization was that nothing exists in the spiritual realm. Whatever exists in the spiritual realm is only purely for the sake of the physical. The physical is primary, spiritual is only to facilitate the physical. Therefore, what is the Egyptian civilization based upon? That even the deities, the superpowers, the spiritual powers, it's only to maintain and guarantee the physicality of the world. Everything's Ophir, everything's earthy. Okay? But that's 7. That's 70 languages. What if also we have a person now that within the same person, it's 71. 71 means this person supersedes 7. That means there's something that exists outside of the physical realm. If Yosef would divulge that he knows 71 languages, this would be a refutation on the foundation of Egyptian civilization, that there's something beyond the 70. And if that's the case, Paro's empire just crumples. Meaning what he was trying to communicate and convey to the population over all these years, that nothing exists outside. All of a sudden now, there's a new level of realization. There's something which supersedes the 7. If that's the case, Egypt cannot continue functioning in its original capacity. Paro will be dethroned. Therefore, he made him take an oath. I'll not take Mitzrayim. Yaakov, take an oath, you will not bury me there. Because if he asks you to violate your oath, you will violate his oath. And if you violate his oath, it's over. There's no Egypt left any longer. That's the understanding. Now, why didn't Yaakov want to be buried in Egypt? So Rashi cites a number of reasons, which are mentioned in the Midrash. One reason was, now, Yaakov came to Egypt in the third year of the famine, at the beginning of the third year. Now, why was there a famine? There was no rain, but there's never rain. There was a lack of water. Water is life. When Yaakov came to Egypt, the famine ceased. Why? Because how were the fields how were they watered? The Nile would rise, or people would take buckets of water and put it in these tributaries. That's how they would water the fields. They would irrigate the fields. It didn't happen naturally. When Yaakov came to Egypt, and he gave the blessing to Pharaoh that when he goes down to the Nile will rise. So all of a sudden now, Nile rises and surge forward, floods the fields. This is why the famine stopped when Yaakov came to Egypt. So Yaakov, as they say, life and death was based upon his words. Water is life. Water is irrigation. Why are the fields in Egypt irrigated? Because Yaakov blessed Pharaoh that when he goes down to the Nile will rise and flood the fields and irrigate the fields. That's Yaakov. So who is the cause of the continuation of the Egyptian existence? And somehow eventually get out of this famine? Yaakov. So what happens if Yaakov dies now? What are they going to do? They're going to deify him. They're going to worship him. Yaakov says, I don't want to be worshipped. Because when God punishes the worshippers of idolatry, he also destroys the object of worship, which is himself. Well, if he's innocent, doesn't make a difference. But since through you, all this blasphemy comes about, which is idolatry, therefore, Yaakov says, I don't want to be there. I don't want to be the cause. And therefore, it'll be identified with me, and they're going to worship me. I don't want to be deified, okay? Another reason Rashi cites, the plague, one of the plagues in Egypt was lice, kinim. The earth turned to lice. Whatever it means. So if his body's in the ground, is in ground interment, what does that mean? That means the earth touching his body is going to start turning to lice. And they can start gnawing away at his body, creeping under his body. He felt it was inappropriate. The third reason, which is given in the Medrash, that Yaakov is what? Yaakov has a certain status. The Egyptians have a status. Now, Yecheskel HaNovi, Yecheskel the prophet, refers to the Egyptians as chamorim, as donkeys. Are they donkeys? They walk on two legs. They don't walk on four legs. They're not beasts of burden. So why they refer to as donkeys? So Maral of Prague says that we have 70 root nations in the world. Every root nation has a certain spiritual capacity. The nation has the least capacity for spirituality of the Egyptians. There's this total spiritual void. In Hebrew, the word chomer means material. Of all the 70 root nations, the one who's most materialistic has the least degree of relevance to spirituality is the Egyptians. They are chamorim. The word chomer means material, physical. They are the ultimate in physicality. As a result of that, there's no spirituality. That's why Egypt was actually the location of all the abominations of the world, whether it was witchcraft, was idolatry, whether it was incest, whether it was adultery, whatever it was, that's what it was. And it was on the most exaggerated level because they had the least degree of spirituality in themselves. So that's the chamor. Chamor means chomer. We find that the Navi refers to Yaakov as Seh, as a sheep. Yaakov is Seh Pizuri Yisrael. Yaakov is like the sheep was the scapegoat. Scapegoat. Now, what's the law if you have a newborn son born in a Jewish family? What are you supposed to do? You're supposed to redeem it. You give 5 silver coins to a Kohen. What happens if you have a cow, first issue of a cow, a male born to its mother? That cow is naturally consecrated. It's brought as a korban in the Temple Mount, in the Beis Hamikdash. It's brought as a korban. That's what you do. What about if you have a chamor, a donkey, the first issue of its womb? Can't bring a non-kosher species as a sacrifice, but you could bring it as what? As an entity, right? You could redeem it. The Torah says a donkey, either you redeem or you break its neck. How do you redeem it? You take a sheep and you say this sheep is a redemption for the donkey, which is the first issue of its mother. That's the way it's done. Now, the Navi refers to Yaakov as a Seh Pizuri Yisrael. So Yaakov says, I'm a Seh, I'm a sheep, they're donkeys. How do you redeem the donkey? Through a sheep. I don't want to be the redemption. That's what he says. I don't want to be the redemption. Therefore, if I'm buried there, I will be the redemption. I don't want to be the redemption. What does it mean he'll be the redemption? If he's buried, he'll be the redemption. How does that somehow get impact on who they are? Yaakov being buried there. So if he's not buried there, he will not be the redemption. Okay. Now, the Maral discusses in his work, Vurs Hashem, why did God choose Egypt as the location for our exile? Right? Could have been anywhere in the world. You're going to be enslaved, you be afflicted, then you will have great wealth. He could have picked somewhere in Africa. Right? Could have. Why did he pick specifically Egypt? Egypt is the people. That's where the Egyptian exile took place. He spent 210 years there. Why? So he explains that of all the root nations, the one that has least relevance to spirituality are the Egyptians. They're the donkeys, they're chomer. They have material. We had to develop from the ground up, from root up, to be spiritual through our own initiatives. Of all the 70 nations, the one that has the least degree of spirituality is who? That's the Egyptians. So if we somehow sprout from there, where are we sprouting from? Not from the spirituality of the Egyptians, because there's nothing to write home on. There's nothing to write home about. But if we would develop and manifest so in another society, where there was a much more significant basis for spirituality, they'll say, you know where the spirituality of the Jew comes from? It emanates from that, the spirituality of this particular nation. As a result of, God says it has to be the place where it's almost a nil point. Nil is almost not there. So it's a concept of ex nihilo. It's something from nothing. It's not limited, and actually the parameters are what the parameters are for other nations. Different parameters. Therefore, that's he said, if I am the sheep, and they are the chamor, and they are they represent the material. When one worships a deity, how do you worship it? You bring it a gift of food, you bring it wine, whatever you bring. That's how you worship it. Because the deity was a human being, that person lived his life as that material person. Okay? So therefore, it had to be Egypt. So if Yaakov would be buried there and they would want to worship it, they would emulate his way. How do you emulate Yaakov? By being more spiritual. If they become more spiritual, that means they're elevating themselves. They're becoming less chamor, they're less material. If they become less material, then we as a Jewish people it puts a limitation on our level of spiritual growth. Therefore, he says, I don't want to be a redemption for them. Let them be who they are. And because they are, there is no spirituality there. Therefore, when you develop, you're going to develop from a nil point. When you develop from a nil point, that's what we call ex nihilo. Ex nihilo, you soar to the greatest heights. But if they themselves are going to be spiritually rehabilitated, because they're going to worship Yaakov and they can emulate his ways to be detached from this abominable behavior, that means the Hamor is going to elevate itself. Therefore, Yaakov says, I don't want to be buried there, because if I'm there, it will compromise the ultimate potential of the Jewish people. Ani bevod Padnaram, when I was returning from Padnaram, that's from Lovan, Mesulai Rochel, my wife Rochel passed away. She passed away in childbirth with her 12th child, with the 12th son of Yaakov. The Eretz Canaan, Bederech Bo Kiras Eretz Lovefros, on the way to the Judean location in Canaan. The Ekbro Shom Baderech Ephros He Beis Lochem, and I buried her on the way to Ephros, which is Bethlehem. That's where she's buried. That's where Kever Rochel is, the grave of Rochel. Now, Rochel was the primary matriarch of the Jewish people, more than Leah. She was the intended wife. The only reason why Leah was married first was because Yaakov was deceived by his father-in-law. So you think, where should have Yaakov buried her? In the Tum Machpelah. He buries her on the way. You'd say he had no choice because he was so far from the destination. He had no choice. But he was within a stone's throw from the Maris Machpelah. So why did he take her to what? To bury in Maris Machpelah. He chose not to. He buried her on the way. See, buried it's like disgraceful. Who do you bury on the road or off the side of a road? It's disgrace. Well, you could have buried her in the Tum Machpelah. So Yaakov says to his son like this: all these years, I know you had some kind of gripe in your heart against me, that I buried your mother on the way and I disgraced your mother. Although I'm asking you to take my remains back to Canaan, and I did not offer that level of respect to your mother. Nevertheless, I wanted you to bury me in Canaan. Okay? What does Yaakov want? Yaakov doesn't want, he wants Yosef to carry through. But if you mistreated my mother and you didn't give her the respect that she deserved, as Yosef understood she deserved, why should I really accommodate your wishes? You didn't do it for my mother. And Yaakov says, I know you have this gripe against me all these years. I'm going to explain it. What's the explanation? Because when the Jews are going to go into exile after the destruction of the first temple, and they're going to pass by the grave of your mother Rachel, she's going to come out of the grave, go to heaven, and supplicate Hashem. And she cries that her children should return to their original boundaries, to the original borders. That's why she had to be buried there. Because she'll be the one to activate the attribute of mercy at that most advanced level, so the Jews should be able to return. Even from Babylon. And they accepted it. Now, so I had asked the question, Yaakov says, I know you've had a gripe against me for 17 years. I'm going to explain it now. If Yaakov knows he has a gripe for 17 years, why did he explain it 17 years earlier? What he's telling him now, he could have told him earlier. Why do you want the man to continue to have this negative feeling towards you? Because you should have done something, you didn't do it. So why is he sharing with Yosef now, although the pain in Yosef's heart was all the years where his mother was buried on the road? So we once said was this, in life, you can only appreciate certain things if you're at a certain stage in life. For instance, You have a son who's a teenager, and you give him sage advice. But because he's a teenager and he hasn't really tasted life, he actually takes it with a grain of salt. But if you'd give that kind of advice to a middle-aged person, because of the experience of life that person has had, he could appreciate what you're telling him. The teenager can't appreciate what you're telling him. Even though he knows the father's telling him something which is true, but he feels it's not true enough. It doesn't guarantee the end result because he doesn't have that experience in life sufficiently. He explains to Yosef, you know why I buried your mother on the road? Because ultimately the Jews are going to exile, and as they pass by her grave, she's going to go and cry before God and supplicate him to bring them back. But yet, when she passes away, he doesn't bury her there. He said, but nevertheless, I want to be buried in Marsa Machpelah. Although he had this gripe all these years, if Yosef would have been explained as he's explaining now, it wouldn't have resonated with him. You know why? Because at this moment, Yaakov is giving over the mantle of leadership to Yosef. As a leader, leadership takes tremendous responsibility. Yosef now has a level of maturity. He's assuming the responsibility for the Jewish people. When you understand that it's who you are, then it makes sense why your mother had to be buried on the road. Because that is that's embedded in your leadership to guarantee their return. And if Rachel, your mother being buried on the roadside, is the only way to coming back, that's what you have to do. Before he assumed the mantle of leadership, to take on the position of his father, he doesn't have that sense of responsibility. So if that's the case, yeah, my father, you could have worked it out differently. You didn't have to bury my mother on the wayside. If that's the case, Yosef wouldn't appreciate it. But now that he's assuming Yaakov is dying and he's becoming the leader, the new leader of the Jewish people, now he could have the appreciation why his mother's buried by the wayside, which before he couldn't have had that level of appreciation.